Hello and welcome to Broken Entertainment. So I'm going to be a little bit late to the party on on this review, but I finally got a chance to listen to the audiobook of Shad M Brooks's Shadows of the Conqueror, which is an epic fantasy novel, and I thought about putting it off for a while, but I kind of wanted to get it out, get this review done while it was still pretty fresh in my mind. So, there's a lot of difficult subjects to cover with this book, and I'm gonna have to kind of tiptoe around them because of the way YouTube is. But it's it's an interesting book. Um, it has, like its main character, it has some very deep flaws, and yet also, like its main character, it has some very interesting qualities as well. And I enjoyed the audiobook, but I'm not sure if I would have finished it if I read it by hand. And part of that is because the audiobook is very, very well done. It's very well narrated by two incredible narrators. But there were points where I kind of phase out. And just to get this out ahead of time here, I am a fan of the author. I'm subscribed to his YouTube channel. I really enjoy his videos. I like what little of him I am able to know through YouTube videos. And so I'm trying to be as fair as I possibly can in this review. And I'll say up front, if you have any sort of, I don't want to call them triggers, right? Because it's kind of loaded language. But if you have difficulty with particularly dark things in fiction and covering everything from murder to other less easily discussed, let's say, things that YouTube doesn't want me to say the words for. And you can imagine what they are. Okay. They're crimes involving specific gender against another specific gender, put it that way. Then this is not the book for you. Just straight up. Okay? Don't, even out of curiosity, because there's a lot of that in here. And it's not always, it's not deeply detailed, but it's there. A lot. A little too much, really. Because one of the things that is difficult with that in this book is that it just doesn't stop coming up. And there's reason for that narratively. But there's also some kind of ham-fisting kind of forced narrative in there that's like, okay, did you need to put that in? Probably not. And that has a lot to do with trying to treat the reality of the situation that existed in a world that is based somewhat on medieval Europe and the ancient world. You know, there is a certain reality of life, and that's reflected in this book. There's an overemphasis on it, I believe, but it is what it is. The main character of this book, and there will be some spoilers in here, but I'm going to try to avoid them as much as I can. The main character of this book is an awful, awful person, and that's the point. The point of the book, the question, the conceit of the book is, can an absolutely terrible person find redemption? And the interesting thing is that it doesn't really answer that question. And that's good, because that's not the kind of question you should be answering in one novel. The character is very easy to dislike. The character's main name, the main character's name is Dalen. He's very easy to dislike, but also kind of interesting to follow. And as the book goes on, you kind of get attached to his struggle to be a better person. And the one thing that helps a lot is that he doesn't try to make excuses for his past. He was a terrible person, and he'll be the first one to tell you. The difficulty, of course, is following a character like that, because generally the protagonist of a book you want to connect with, you want to understand, to feel for, to worry about. But it's hard to do that when they're literally worse than Hitler. But they are interesting to follow. You're probably not gonna connect with them, but they are an interesting character to follow. And one of the difficulties of this book is that this character is very, very powerful, and I've seen reviews that just straight up call him a Gary Stu. That I would disagree with, but I understand where it comes from. And a Gary Stu being a male version of a Mary Sue, and kind of the assumption there is that he's got all these powers, he's super smart, he's very good at engineering, he's a great strategist, etc., etc., etc. But the problem with Mary Sue or Gary Stu is that they're also incredibly well liked. They also are almost worshipped by everybody they meet, and they are essentially flawless characters, and their abilities and so on come from just like nowhere. They're just perfect. That is not Dalen. Dalen has major flaws. He's a horrible, horrible human being that even calling him a person is a stretch. So you got the flaws. You got the fact that he's had a whole lifetime of experience where these abilities of his do come from somewhere. Now, his intelligence, of course, is naturally born in. But that said, he is extraordinarily powerful. He is at times able to pull things off that much more experienced people with the same powers don't actually think is a possible thing. And in that regard, there are times when that can be frustrating, but I would not go so far as to call him a Gary Stu. And he's certainly not well liked. The side characters are very easy by comparison to connect with. There's Arik, who is a holy man, and Lyra, who is sort of a paladin type of individual. And Lyra is a very emotionally scarred, very damaged person, and you find out why later on. And Arik also has his own problems. And they're very likable people, actually. Especially Arik. Arik is a great character and is almost kind of like a stand-in for the reader. Of like, you want to like the main character, but you're there anyway, following him. And the dialogue, there's a lot of crying, okay? Like a lot of crying. The main character cries a lot. And given the weight of emotions involved, some of that is certainly warranted. Some of it comes across as kind of like, yeah, okay, a little over dramatic, but that's all right. Let's remember, this is a debut novel. There's always going to be the debut novel is always going to be weaker than the ones that follow. Now, the world building is really interesting. It's very good. Very well done. It's a very interesting world that definitely sticks out in your mind. It is not the kind of world that you're going to forget right away. Um, it's in the vein of a Brandon Sanderson type of world where it's very, very different from our own. And the only problem with that is that the author spends a lot of time talking about the world. And that's where I say, if I had been reading it, I may have put it down. Because there's, especially in the beginning, there's a lot of exposition. And it's not always delivered naturally, unfortunately. But it's not necessarily crippling, especially in the audiobook. But it is heavy, especially in the beginning. And you can kind of see what he's trying to do. There's a lot of influence from Brandon Sanderson, and that's fine. Every author has their influences. I'm influenced by Brandon Sanderson. There's no copying of Brandon Sanderson. He does not copy Brandon Sanderson. All of his ideas are definitely his own. They're very interesting, and they're easily the best part of the book. That and the last however many pages 2 hours is. But we'll get into that. The problem is that you get this exposition over and over and over again, and it's there to teach you the magic system so that you can develop your understanding of it along with the main character, who is also new to this. So that if that had been more polished and more edited, as far as my understanding, there was not a content editor. That would have helped a lot. Narrow that down, make it more natural, polish it out. But it is very well done. It's a very specific system. It goes into great detail, and it works according to its own rules. All of those are great things. If you like hard magic systems, it's the kind of hard magic system that you can kind of sit down and digest and think about, because it's very complex in what it can do. The other thing I'll say is that a lot of this exposition should only happen once. So once we get the second book, it should be much lighter on that. Not only because the author will be more experienced, but because the initial learning and all that crap's going to be out of the way. The biggest problem, the biggest turnoff is by far the crimes committed when the main character was essentially living their first life. It's very dark. It's very difficult. I don't feel for the main character at any point in the book. Okay. I'm interested. I want to see if he continues to try and make the world better and to try and make amends for what he has done. And there's a great scene between him and Arik late in the book that is very well earned and is pretty awesome. And it's the first point, and it's very late in the book, and it's the first point where I'm like, now I'm kind of invested in who you are rather than who you were. Almost treating them like two different characters. And indeed, at the very ending of the book, they're not two different characters, but it kind of treats it that way as well. And the crimes he commits, though, or had committed, are just, they're really not something I can connect with the main character on. It's not the kind of thing where you go, oh, well, they had a really hard life and they made some wrong choices. It's take Hitler and turn up the dial a little bit. Okay? There's not any systemic genocide, but that's about the only thing. And that is the point of the book. The point of the book, of course, is can that kind of person be redeemed? Is there ever a point where they have done enough? And it's really kind of the point of the whole series, I believe, because it's not the kind of thing you can examine in one book. The problem is, if you can't connect with the character, at no point do you feel like there are stakes. And I'm not feeling stakes in this book until very near the end. And those stakes are not making me worry about the main character, they're making me worry about everybody else. It's also the first time he's really challenged. There's no point during the book up until near the end where you're like, wow, this could all fall apart. Okay. And it's like, this is the third time I've said this, but it's like there's two different books. I said it with Raya and the Last Dragon, it was like two different movies. I said it with Godzilla vs. Kong, and I'm saying it here. The first vast majority of the book got no real stakes. There's not any real tension. It's mostly focused on the world building and on the magic system and on repeatedly reminding us of how horrible the main character used to be. But the end of the book is very, very strong. It stops most of the exposition, and the character is finally put into a position physically and then emotionally where there's a real possibility they may not make it out of this. And it's the first time you're like, wow, this could all come crashing down. And that you need that moment in every book. You need a couple of moments like that in every book for a main character, where things look like they're going to get bad, and then they get worse, and you think they're going to triumph, but they fail. You know, and I'll talk about that in an upcoming video on Brandon Sanderson, because he's like a master at that. But the last part of the book is very, very strong. But that, if that tension and stakes had been there from the get-go, it's very much easier to be drawn into the book. But I keep going back to the crimes, and that's what makes me say I have a hard time recommending the book. Not because I think it's bad, because I don't, actually. I think there's a lot of the usual debut indie author stuff floating around. You know, the dialogue's not polished in every spot. It can be a little melodramatic in places. There's a lot of exposition and so on. But it's very... It's good as a debut novel. And the author has taken a huge risk in writing this kind of book as their first novel. This is the kind of book that I think he should have waited for 5, 6, 7, 8 books down the road. And I know this was a dream of his, and I'm absolutely glad that he got it done. I'm looking forward to the next book because I do want to see it develop. I want to see where he goes. I want to see his writing improve. And I want to watch him grow as an author. But it's very, very hard for me to consider all that was done in the book and recommend it. And if you can put up with that kind of darkness, then it's a very interesting book. And I can for a time, as long as things turn around. And I think the books going forward will turn around. But the things he did to people would be bad enough if they were talked about once or twice, but it comes up routinely, repeatedly, and it's like you just can't get away from the R word. You know what I'm saying? And that's where it's like, man, I don't have a problem with that being in a story because it happens, unfortunately. And when it comes to this kind of setting, when it comes to a medieval or ancient world, that's very likely going to happen more than now. Possibly more accepted than now, with the victims being shamed, which they are in this book. Not by the author. The author is not supporting any of this. It's very clear these were all awful things. So if you're willing to read through that, if you're willing to see that come up, not in detail, but still over and again, if you're willing to deal with characters carrying the trauma of that experience, and if you're willing to follow a main character who has done terrible things like that, then read the book. Give it a shot. Because I think the world building, the core of the writing, the side characters in particular, the ending of the book, I think that's all very well done. And are there debut novel issues in there? Sure, but my debut novel will have debut novel issues. Everybody's debut novel has debut novel issues. It's your first one. So it's a very high fantasy world, very fantastic magic system, fantastic world building. I just wish it would have cut back by about half on the exposition and put more stakes and tension into the rest of the novel that was there near the end. So let me know if you've read this book, what you think of it. Again, it's Shadow of the Conqueror by Shad M Brooks. I will put a link to his YouTube channel and his video on this book, which is what I have up here on the screen. Let me know if you've read it. Let me know if you're a fan of Shad. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of the premise. If you can deal with that kind of story, or if you would prefer a main character that you can connect with as a human being. So if you like the video, hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing and hit the bell for notifications, and I will see you next time.